Welcome to episode 36 of the Tax Professionals podcast. Peter Rayney, current CIOT president, joins us for episode 2 of Tax Career Success Secrets, where high-achieving tax professionals share the secrets behind career success.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
I enjoy the technical side of tax, analysing legislation, case law and guidance, and always have since working in tax. However, I got on the impression that maintaining a strong focus on this would hinder my progression as a tax advisor. Now, to some extent, that is definitely true, but I've recently realised that you can actually achieve senior roles whilst maintaining technical work at the core of what you do, and Peter has done exactly that, which I find intriguing. Peter is the current president of the CIOT and owns his own tax consulting firm, which he set up in 2009. Before that, he was BDO's National Tax Technical Partner. He's a prolific tax writer, winning Taxation's Tax Writer of the Award year and unprecedented 3 times, and enjoys tax lecturing. Outside of tax, he enjoys music events and being a West Ham United fan. The episode covers an overview of Peter's career from around 2 minutes 45 into the episode, and this includes his views on being a mixed tax expert as opposed to a specialist. We then move on to Peter sharing his tips for good tax writing at around 15 minutes 30, before moving on to how tax writing has positively impacted Peter's career, as well as how you can get involved in tax writing. We then talk about how he has maintained technical tax work at the core of what he does at around 27 minutes, and also what his role as National Tax Technical Partner at BDO covered. We then move on to the final part of the episode, which is a great piece of career advice that Peter had received, which is roughly at 33 minutes, and then we talk about Peter's 3 tips to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. The timers just mentioned are detailed in the details section of the episode in your podcast app, or you can see them in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP36. Make sure that you don't miss any future episodes of the podcast by subscribing or signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide whether you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. I've got loads more Tax Career Success Secret episodes in the pipeline, so watch this space. The previous episode was with Bill Dodwell, who is the current director of the Office of Tax Simplification. You can access this episode in your podcast player of choice by just searching for the Tax Professionals Podcast, or by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP35. Without further ado, let's get to it. If you don't mind then, Peter, just to start off the discussion today, could you tell us a little bit about you and your tax career to date?
I'm the current president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, and I've been in post now since last November, and I've got an 18-month stint because of the lockdown, so we decided to extend the presidential term for 18 months. My background, I suppose, is followed a fairly well-trodden path. I qualified as a chartered accountant way back in the mid-70s, and then went on to specialise in tax quite quickly. And I've been with some younger people won't know, but there was a firm called Deloitte Haskins and Sells, was where I spent a lot of my life in tax. Also, before that, Arthur Anderson, and then I finished up really with BDO Stoy Hayward, or BDO as it's called today, and I spent probably near enough 20 odd years with them, and I was a consulting tax partner. And then towards the end of my career with BDO, I was their national tax technical partner. So, and people will know that I'm a bit of a tax nerd. I do actually write quite a few tax books. Perhaps two of the most popular ones would be, one is an online work by Kroner, which is the corporate tax manual, practical corporate tax manual. And my annual publication is Bloomsbury title, which is tax planning for family and managed companies. And I also do a bit of tax lecturing. And of course, during lockdown, I've been used to Zoom webinars and giving webinars on Zoom, which actually means a much wider reach in terms of delegates and audiences.
Yeah, that's definitely been a nice benefit, hasn't it, of being able to do online things, is you get people from all over. I suppose you lose that personal touch a bit there, don't you? Because you can't speak to people properly afterwards.
Yeah, it's like the most lecturers, and I'm certainly one of those that subscribe to it, that you can't beat a live audience. In much the same way as Morecambe and Wise actually wanted live audiences when they performed. So lecturing is a performance. So I would always prefer a live audience. But given with the constraints, the next second best thing is to actually talk to people online.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And you currently run your own tax consulting business now as well, don't you?
Yes. I formed my tax consulting business in fact, September 2009. And it's I've been really excited, and I really enjoy being my own boss. You can't beat being an independent. And we do lots of work for accountants and advise them on a whole range of tax areas. And one of the things I've always been glad of is that I never specialise too much in a particular tax area, so I actually am able to cover off everything from corporate tax, CGT, IHT, SDLT, and reorganisations and demergers. So there's not one area. I mean, apart from VAT, I think, where I don't hold myself as a specialist, but I can probably do high-level consultancy in all those other areas. And what's really been great is that I don't have to answer to anybody apart from my clients.
Yeah. So I would say nowadays it's probably quite unusual, isn't it, to still have someone that can advise on such a breadth of tax knowledge and topics. Do you think it's still possible to do that today, or do you feel like because you've kind of lived through the times where all these rules are being brought in, that it's been easier for you to do that?
It's a good question. I think my generation, there were more of us like I am, but we actually delved into all areas of tax, because that's what I think. If you joined a larger firm, even 5-10 years ago, you were asked to specialise in a particular area, whether it be employment taxes or corporate taxes or international tax, etc. But I do think some firms are realising now that the benefit of actually an all-rounder, because it's quite often you get the case where, in terms of giving client advice, if you're a specialist that only covers one area and you haven't got a good all-round knowledge, things can easily get lost in between the gaps, as it were. So you might have a couple of specialists acting, and because there isn't that sort of joined up thinking as that would be in the mind of one generalist, as it were, mistakes can easily be made, actually, and through no fault of individuals involved. But if you have a sort of all-round knowledge of tax, whilst you might not be able to advise on a particular aspect, there's a problem there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things actually nowadays, isn't it? It's almost just having that awareness of a lot of topics. Then, at least if you have the awareness, you can usually pick up on them maybe being a problem or maybe being an advisory point. So then you can, bring in other people, can't you? If you need to.
And of course, as a president of the Chartered Institute of Tax, I'm bound to say that's one of the virtues of our exams, where candidates have to have a sort of pretty good all-round knowledge of tax, and their papers that test all aspects. And of course, they can then specialise as part of their training and CTA exams to OMB taxation, for example, or private client. But beforehand, they will actually have a fairly good all-round knowledge of most areas of tax, which will equip them well.
Yeah, I did own a managed business, actually, and I feel like that's been good for that awareness, because it's quite practical for the day-to-day stuff as well. Like, because I work in employment tax, I don't need to know really that much about stamp duty or inheritance tax or private client tax, but I do need to know a bit about corporation tax and VAT sometimes. So it's been quite helpful from that perspective.
I mean, OMBs, of course, are I think it's one of the most popular areas of tax, because there's so many OMBs to be dealt with, and to work to. And the key point really with OMB taxation, really, it means that you're you can move quite easily between shareholder stuff and corporate stuff.
Yeah, which I suppose gives an interesting variety of work for you as well.
Yeah.
So, what made you retire from BDO and move to create your own tax consulting firm? Was there any kind of reason behind that, or did you just fancy something a bit different?
It's a good question. Of course, it occurred at the time of the last sort of, 2009 was the last sort of recession. And I think, the firms were actually looking quite hard at their partner numbers. And I was equally, in fact, I couldn't say it then, but I was actually quite interested always in going on my own as an independent tax consultant. To me, that was the holy grail, I suppose. And I sort of trained myself up to the day that when I would possibly become an independent tax advisor. And that's why, and probably one of the most important things I did a lot of IT training, and I sat a couple of exams, diplomas as it were, in sort of PowerPoint, Excel, Word, because I knew that would be invaluable to me as an independent.
Yeah, good stuff. So then, because obviously you are currently the CIOT president, is that something that you always aspired to do as well, or is it something that just came up later in life?
It's almost like politics, isn't it? I think Tony Blair, for example, never expected to become prime minister, and of course the death of John Smith sort of preempted that in the Labour Party. And I suppose, I became a council member, and that was something I could easily have done. More easier to do, of course, being an independent tax advisor, that I can had the freedom to say I can join CIOT Council. And then after my sort of time on council, it wasn't very long actually. I think I joined council in 2016, and within 3 or 4 years' time, I got sort of the pat on the back and say they would like me to put myself forward as president, which was actually fantastic. So yeah, I was probably in the right place at the right time. I think these days, we're doing more and more to make sure our council, CIOT Council, is much more representative of our membership, and so we're working hard to be more, broaden the diversity of our council.
Yeah. So I always have this kind of idea in my head that everyone on council is like past, say, 50 or something. Is that like an accurate representation?
I suppose if you'd asked me that 5 years ago, yes. But we now have a lot more younger members, and obviously we appeal in terms of diversity as well. So and I think, because now we have a nomination committee, a proper council selection process, we're much better with that aspect.
Yeah. For someone who is interested in becoming a member of council, is there anything that they can do to do that?
Well, obviously get involved with the Chartered Institute of Taxation. And of course, a lot of council members were chosen, of course, because they were the great and good in taxation. But we realise, of course, that we need a far wider range of skills on council, not just people who knew about tax, because actually, ultimately, it's a charity that we're running, a charitable body, and therefore we need people who actually would step into the shoes of a trustee role. And certainly, we would welcome people who have got marketing skills, IT skills, commercial skills, etc. And of course, that mirrors in our the makeup of council, that we are bringing people in through the nominations committee, and they go through a selection process, and they get interviewed. And of course, now we're looking at filling skills gaps. Yeah.
Interesting. I never really knew how to do it before. I mean, I spoke to Ray McCann a little bit about it, because I think that was something he was interested in implementing. Well,
he was a previous CIOT president, and I was really delighted to serve him as a CIOT president. And he gave me lots of valuable advice before I came CIOT president.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm sure you've achieved a lot over the course of your tax career. I mean, one that stands out for me in particular is receiving Tax Writer of the Year 3 times, which I'm sure you're probably the only person that's ever done that. But for you personally,
I do believe it's unprecedented, actually. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But are there any kind of moments in your career that stand out as moments that you're most proud of for you personally?
Well, actually, first of all, establishing my own independent tax consultancy business is a very proud moment for me. And also equally, I'm very proud to serve the Chartered Institute of Taxation as its president. Indeed, I will go down in the annals as the first COVID president, hopefully the only COVID president.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique title to have.
Yeah, but also a challenging one, which has been really a fantastic experience because we've had to think about how to do things in a much different way and use online events and obviously exams. With the CIOT, we've had to bring our exams online as well very quickly to cope with the demand from students.
Yeah. I mean, I don't personally sit the exams anymore because I'm already qualified, but I've heard good things from students who are still sitting it. And I think a lot of people like the fact it's now open book as well, or at least it is for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
So on the flip side then, to kind of proudest moments, have you got any kind of particular challenges that you've had in your career that kind of stand out to you?
It's a great question. I suppose the challenge was always been, I've always been quite, I wouldn't say ambitious, but I've always been hardworking. And I suppose the challenge is for me is actually not to work too hard and actually look after my mental health. Those to me are my guiding things at the moment. Because I'm very much of the Margaret Thatcher school that I can work all hours, etc. But I need to know that actually ultimately it's the detriment of my personal health, etc. So no, that's a quite important challenge for me, is make sure I don't work too hard.
So what do you do then nowadays to try and make sure that you don't work too many hours and you get a bit more of a better balance than maybe you did in the past?
Well, I try and get a lot of exercise in. I do walk, hopefully walk every day to get my weight down and clear my head. I also enjoy watching West Ham live, which is only something I've actually been able to resume. And of course, I like going out. I'm quite a social animal, but of course that has been really COVID has put the kibosh on much of that. So keeping in contact with people, and of course I've got to see a lot more of my wife during COVID. Of course, being locked in the same house. So yeah,
me and my other half shout that's being good and bad because it means we also drive each other the wrong way more.
Yeah, it's a good test, isn't it?
So kind of back to tax writing then. So this is something that's clearly important to you and something that you enjoy doing. I mean, like what first motivated you to start doing it and get into it? Can you remember kind of the moment?
Yeah, almost after I qualified, I suppose. It might sound really strange to most people, but I really enjoy tax. I love it, in fact. And I thought that after I qualified, what can you do now? And of course, I turned my hand to lecturing and writing, and I thought, of course, when you qualify, you think you know everything about tax there is to know, but of course, you've only just begun, as you know, only just begun, and the only way I could continue my CPD really in an effective form was actually to talk about tax and write about tax, and I think there's a sort of virtual circle really that the more you do of that, the better you are at doing your consultancy work, because obviously you come to it with all that stuff in your mind, and so it makes you a better consultant, of course, if you've done writing and lecturing, as a lot of people say. And also make you a better consultant lecturer because you become more practically minded when you give lectures rather than just being somebody who just does lectures on tax and doesn't actually get their hands dirty in client work. You know what I mean? So you come to lecturing and writing in a much more practical way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think actually, because I contributed to the Tolly's Finance Act Handbook this year. That was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And it really gave me the chance to, because now I'm becoming more senior in my role, I get less time to, do research into guidance and legislation, etc. And I felt like I was losing touch a bit with some of the new stuff that was coming out in terms of like the specific detail. And that was really nice for me because I could jump back into the legislation, I could give my commentary on it. And as you say, then when I'm talking to clients now, it's fresh in the mind, from a practical standpoint as well, not just a completely technical one.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely.
Yeah. So since you have written so many articles now, I mean, you probably have an idea of how many hundreds that is now, as well as your books.
Well, I mean, I can tell you way back in 2000 and probably 7, I did my 100th article for accountancy. So that shows you how long I've been writing, really.
Yeah, and so I'm sure
a lot more since then.
You have written a lot more since then.
Yeah.
So since you've written so many articles and even books, then is there anything that you've learned in particular about kind of how to write well, and have you got any tips that you can share with people?
I think a lot of people tell me this. I'm normally quite a modest person, but they do say I'm quite simple to understand. I try and write the stuff though that it's simple to read and accessible, and therefore I try to keep my sentences short, try and avoid too much complexity, and I try and it's almost like breaking down a car into its manageable parts, and trying to explain things very clearly, and don't assume that the reader knows anything, as it were. Start from almost basics and then build up to a crescendo where you get into more complex areas. But I always think one of the things I've always learned is that if you put practical examples in within your writing, where you actually take what you've written and actually then apply it in a practical sense, that sort of reinforces the knowledge. And I think for me, doing practical examples is one of the things I've always liked to do, even though it's a lot more work. You need to make sure, as you to kind of always get the numbers exactly right. You have to double check and treble check. But yeah, the use of practical examples, keeping it simple, keep the language simple, are my guiding principles.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I've definitely found hard personally previously is keeping like short, simple sentences. Like I am guilty of lots of commas and really long sentences to try and get a point across, whereas I completely agree with you. It's hard to do, but if you can have shorter sentences to make each point, then it's, I suppose, more easily accessible, isn't it, for people?
Yeah.
Easier for them to digest. Do you ever use examples that you've actually seen in real life as well, or do you always make them up?
No, I try as far as possible to base it on real life. And certainly some of my comprehensive examples, what I call case studies, are based on real life, but obviously details slightly changed or facts slightly changed, and certainly names changed. But I think that's the best way. If you've done something and advised on it, then you've got that sort of practical, in-depth knowledge, which is easy to bring out an example then.
Yeah, agreed. I suppose in a way it's almost like making an exam question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I was actually for a very short time a CIOT examiner, and I did some work there, and they always encourage us to write certainly questions based on things that we've come across in practice, which is obviously the best way to test a student. But the marking wasn't, because one of the things is in those days when you set a question, you had to mark all the scripts that answer that question. So yeah, marking proved quite onerous.
Yeah, can you imagine? It's the hardest thing to do, isn't it? Because it's subjective in some ways as well, isn't it? So to getting everyone on the same page, I imagine, is quite difficult.
Yeah, and it requires a lot of time actually to do the job properly.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, you kind of show anyway why the CIOT exams are so good when the examiners are basing it off real life examples as well, making it completely practical. So do you feel like doing all the writing that you've done in articles, magazines, etc., do you feel like that's had a positive impact then on your career, particularly now when you've started your own consulting business?
Yes, I think it sort of helped me to build up a personal brand almost in tax. And I think a lot of questions or queries or inquiries that we receive, a lot of them generally start with that. Well, we saw your article in taxation in such year, or in accountancy in such year. Or we got your article off a Google search, and because it's something we were looking to do, or something we were interested in, or we need advice on, and your name popped up. So I think it's quite a good form. I mean, I didn't do it to be to advertise myself, but looking back, it certainly built up my professional profile amongst the accounting community.
Yeah. I think probably because you've got such a catalogue of articles that you've done as well now, when people search, you're more likely to come up. So I think some people probably go out there writing articles to try and win clients, and they've written like one article and then they're disappointed when, they've got no leads from it.
Yeah, it's certainly established your credentials when you can write clearly on a technical stuff, because people say, well, you must know something about this, because you wouldn't be able to write about it. But I can show you there's one particular article did for taxation, probably 5 or 6 years ago, on property incorporations. And I think of all the areas where an article has generated business, that one article alone, I think probably has generated about at least 25 inquiries. Wow. Easily.
Yeah, that's good. For anyone that's interested in writing for magazines, or maybe even contributing to publications like what you've done, is there anything that they can do to try and, I suppose, increase the chances of that, or go out and do it?
Well, if I take my own experience, I mean, I suppose a lot of this comes from getting yourself around. I mean, I started to write for what was the old CIOT tax practitioner, which was the forerunner of the tax advisor, simply because I met the editor at a conference, and I said, I'm interested in writing. I'd like to write something, and it's that sort of. I mean, yes, you could write a letter to somebody, a taxation editor, or a tax advisor editor, or indeed accountancy. People are always looking for good articles, good print, but I do know from my experience with talking to editors, they don't really want people to sell particular products or themselves in a sort of overt way. And what they're looking for is really good technical articles which are practical and helpful to their readership. So if you want to have a go at that, then absolutely. And I would actually, one thing when I started my article writing, because I was quite junior at the time, I always asked my tax partner then at Deloitte whether he would look at it for me before I sent them in, because I think it's quite important if you're such a young newbie in tax to have that overall review of quality.
Yeah, all good advice. I mean, like, if you do say write a letter or an email to Taxation or Tax Advisor magazine, is the way you think that you can increase the chance of that actually, if you actually going to then write an article and have it published?
Yeah, but I think basically you a number of ways, but of course one thing you could do is basically look at something that is really new, important, or practical, topical, and tell them that you would like to write an article on it for them. Might be a better, possibly on balance, a better approach than writing your article and sending it to them. So, because actually, what might happen is they've already got articles already lined up on that subject. So, probably an intro email might be the best route, because if they've already got it commissioned by somebody else, then obviously they're not interested at the moment. So having that sort of dialogue up front would probably be the best way of going forward.
Yeah. So I think it's a good idea actually to go with like an article idea almost, because I imagine they get a lot of almost random inquiries just saying I'd like to write.
Yeah, but what they don't like, I think, is simply a salesman exercise.
Yeah.
You've got to write almost from the heart of trying to be helpful to readership rather than trying to be overtly selling yourself, as it were.
Yeah, that's just kind of reminded me back to earlier when you said you just love tax, and obviously you're a good tax writer as well. So maybe that's clearly contributed to you being able to write such good articles over the years.
Yeah, I think in a way it's like all jobs. If you love doing it, you do it. You tend to do it quite well.
Yeah,
but there are certainly times I have to say that I would give anything to actually be a shelf stacker in Sainsbury's. When it gets stressful, yeah.
What times are those? And is that just when you're really busy with stuff? And
yeah, when there's too many people trying to be pleased and etc. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's hard to do, isn't it? Particularly, I imagine, as a sole practitioner. Is it just you?
Well, my lovely wife is my office manager, so what she says goes, basically. So yeah. But yeah, on the subject of that, I mean, I think after having so many years being in a big, medium-sized firm, for me, I didn't really want to deal with staff anymore. So that was it.
Yeah.
I remember at BDO. I mean, the hours I used to spend on appraisals at least two or three times a year, and meetings for admin meetings, etc. You can get quite sucked into a lot of admin that goes around managing a big firm.
Yeah. The impression I got before coming into our chat today was that you kind of built your career almost around being technical or strong technically, and I'm still getting that impression as well today. How have you managed to, I suppose, keep the technical elements as a core part of your role while still, I suppose, achieving success and getting senior roles? Because I feel like nowadays there's a lot more focus on, say, sales or leadership if you want to be a partner, for example.
Yeah, well, luckily I don't have to be a partner anyway. I'm my own boss. So, but that gives me also the freedom to do my writing without any restrictions on my time. And of course, the reason why I think I'm pretty good at keeping up to date is because I still update both my corporate tax book and my owner managed companies book. They are actually updated throughout the year. So, I think I'm fairly well apprised of tax developments because I have to be to update the books. it's a rigorous discipline actually, and those people that write tell you that is the way they keep up to date, and that's because that's the way they can remember things, because they've actually had to think about it and write it up rather than just coming to it cold.
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually, because when you just read like a piece of legislation, like it's hard for it to stick, isn't it? Because it's quite abstract at that point.
Yeah.
It's not until you really have to apply it does it really kind of stick, and you start connecting the dots in your head almost.
Indeed. Yeah.
So again, really, tax writing's kind of come back into helping you almost keep the technical work as a core part of what you do.
Yeah. I think probably I still, of my total time, even with the presidency of the CIOT and my client work, I'd probably say I spend a good 15-20% of my time on writing, whether that be articles, book updates, and of course include that in my lecturing or webinars.
Yeah. Good. So kind of, I think related to this is, I think was the title of your role at BDO in the end, National Technical Partner or National Tax Technical Partner. Yeah. So what does that role actually entail? And is it still possible to have a role like that these days, do you think?
I think most firms will have something like me. Most big firms certainly would have a national, because actually they want somebody, certainly when you've got a lot of tax people and you don't really want to reinvent the wheel when people give advice, then knowledge management is a very key aspect of that, and making sure that everybody across the firm is up to date on a particular area. And of course, where you had maybe one set of some really good, fantastic advice over maybe in the Birmingham office, making sure that was shared nationally, because when somebody had almost the same problem in London or in Bristol, they didn't start from scratch. And therefore, one of the roles was that you're making sure that there was good knowledge management and assimilation of what the firm did in tax across the firm, so that could be shared with everybody for the firm's benefit. And of course, there are other aspects of that role, making sure what the firm's view was on tax policy, various aspects, being a spokesman for the firm, organising technical updates and briefings. A lot of the knowledge management work goes across somebody who's a national tax technical partner. Of course, then you would also be the go-to person where somebody may have a technical problem, and they use you almost like internal counsel. So it's quite a fantastic role, really. But one of the downsides is you have to give up quite a lot of your client work.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that actually, because that sounds like it's quite time consuming. I mean, did you have a team when you were at BDO then that helped you with those things, or was it primarily you?
I had a team underneath me, at least 2 or 3 people, and one of that was making sure that the firm's internal tax portal, which was part of the knowledge management offering, was completely up to date and made sure that we were successful. And of course, one of the things I introduced at BDO, which I don't know whether they still continue these, but was actually technical sharing meetings in London, where we basically, people came to discuss points on a particular client or transaction they were working on. That was all written up and then distributed across the firm. So it was a form of knowledge gathering and knowledge dissemination.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting role to me. I think particularly for anyone that likes the technical side of tax, it sounds almost ideal. But so how much time did you have left then to work on clients after doing all those?
Probably 15-20%.
Yeah, it's much lower down. But I suppose that's almost a trade-off, isn't it, for getting?
Yeah, exactly. And but the thing, I suppose it was that. I mean, I quite enjoyed doing it for, I think it was 4 years. But after that, being an independent, having my own clients, it was quite refreshing to go back to the real world.
Yeah, I suppose it's set you up well as well, because again, from a technical perspective, you've been involved in so many discussions and you've helped keep everyone else up to date. It's like it's already in your head, isn't it? It's not something. Well, obviously you need to keep up to date still, but it's definitely a big advantage, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think, like all these things, they've all been, everything I've done, I suppose, my career has always been incrementally beneficial.
I mean, is there any one thing that you think has been like the most beneficial? Is it like a singular point over the years, or something that you consistently done that you think's really helped?
My book, Tax Planning for Owned and Managed Companies, which I'm given to understand that is widely respected in the sort of professional community.
So, a bit of a different angle then now. So, I'm sure over the course of your career, particularly when you're more junior, I imagine you probably received a lot of advice from a lot of different people. Is there like any particular piece of advice that you were given, that's always stood by you, that you've always remembered and that stands out?
Yeah, I think almost going back to my days of Arthur Anderson, really, when I first started in tax, was to actually make sure that in giving any advice, and make sure you just double check the law. So you'd always have, and I'm sorry to say this, yellow books, which is my preference. I always tend to, on every bit of advice I give, I would say, yeah, unless it doesn't really involve a particular area of law, I would always double check the section and read it again and reread it just to make sure. So yeah, that bit of advice that was given to me by a tax manager at Arthur Anderson served me in good stead, because I always go back to the law when I give advice, double check it.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because it's very easy to just get the slight wrong angle if you just try and remember it in your head instead. And obviously with tax law, that can end up being the difference between the right and wrong outcome, can't it?
And sometimes, I've surprised myself. I thought that section said that, but actually there's a word there that means that something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's made worse as well, actually, when you read, say, HMRC guidance something, and they're saying their interpretation.
Yeah.
I always try and avoid reading HMRC's guidance first, because I feel like it can skew or bias.
I mean, I read it after to get comfortable, but I always go to the law first.
Yeah, I think I always say, basically, get your interpretation first. If HMRC's matches it, great, no issues. If for some reason it's different, is it me? Have I misunderstood something? Do I need to reread it, figure it out? No, I don't think it's me. And in that case, you've got a different interpretation, which is fine, but you just need to make clients aware of it, I think, don't you? Then there's a risk associated with challenge. So if you were to kind of look back at you at the start of your career now, and you know what you know now, is there a particular piece of advice that you would give yourself, do you think, to set you up for the rest of your career?
Well, I would think certainly you don't get to be good at tax by doing it on a sort of superficial basis. You actually have to, I think, to do well at tax, you have to love it. And you have to love all the nuances that go with that, and you have to work very hard. I suppose that was advice I gave myself, but always make the best of discussion forums and talk to other people who are also good at tax. You learn so much by just talking to people. Yeah, one man is not an island, as they say.
Yeah, completely. And actually, I quite like having those technical discussions with the people. I think a lot of people shy away from it, actually. I don't know if that's the same in your experiences, but because it's complicated and difficult.
Yeah. I think one thing that, maybe it's my own experience, but one thing that tends to shine through very often is that, whereas a lot of people are very guarded with their intellectual property, I think, most of the tax people I meet are quite generous and are willing to share ideas, as long as you don't abuse the privilege. But I've got quite a good network of people who I've known for many years, and they don't feel anything by just ringing me up and say, double check this point, or what do you think about this? And we all learn from that, actually, but even though, we willingly give up a bit of time to help somebody, but we learn something from in that process.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of this book. It's called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yeah, I've heard of that book, definitely. Yeah.
So it's a book I read, actually, and within that, it almost demyths this kind of concept of competition and, trying to always just better yourself and no one else. And when you help other people, that actually helps. That even helps yourself, even when you're sharing these ideas as what you're talking about now. I'm a firm believer in that, actually, after reading that book.
It's Stephen Covey book, isn't it?
It is Stephen Covey. Yeah. So it's a great book, I think. It's definitely changed my perspective on how I've approached a lot of things since reading it, that's for sure. So kind of a last question then for you, Peter. So a lot of listeners to the podcast are people who are interested in improving and progressing their own tax careers. Mm-hmm. Have you kind of got 3 top tips that you can share with them to help them?
Be inquisitive, I think, one, in terms of tax. Don't just, if you want to learn something, really read around it. And the importance of actually research, certainly these days, being able to research matters in tax is very important. So knowing your way around all the helpful websites, etc. Secondly, I'll probably think hard work. I think if you only excel at tax if you do it 24/7 personally. And lastly, always keep learning. There's nothing, every day. I think one of the great things for me about tax is that there's never one day I don't learn anything. I'm always learning something, and it's a lifelong education. Is the thing that I love about it, really.
It is. I mean, there's so many different skills that kind of come into play, don't they? Working as a tax professional, it's not just the technical side, and then there's lots of soft skills that can come along with it as well, and even IT skills.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is that for me is certainly underrated is actually having the privilege of working with so many very interesting, aspirational individuals and businesses. You can learn a lot even from your clients.
Yeah, you can. And actually, on that note, I recently had a case where I was almost working with the client to produce something for their client and getting direct feedback from them. And I just think that was like the best piece of feedback I could ever have, because, they're looking from a practical, non-tax perspective. So to me, that was just invaluable.
Yeah. And I think what happens is almost, I don't know, but by osmosis, you almost pick up a lot of business and commercial skills along the way. So it makes you a more rounded advisor on tax.
It does, yeah. And it's nice almost trying to get into the head of the business as well. Like if you're talking to an MD as opposed to an FD or a head of tax, they're not really that bothered about, the technicals, are they, behind tax? They just want the outcome and they want it to fit in with the business. So it helps you to get into that mindset, I think, doesn't it? You kind of got any closing thoughts you want to add, Peter? Anything else you'd like to say before we close it off, would you?
Thank you very much for taking the time to interview me. I've enjoyed the experience very much.
Good. Thank you, Peter. And for people who want to learn a little bit more about you or get in contact, is there any place in particular that they can go to?
My website, peterrayney.co.uk.
Yeah. And you're very active on LinkedIn as well.
And Twitter. I'm very much a Twitter, but you'll get a little bit of tax from me on Twitter, but mainly other things.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, which was the second episode of Tax Career Success Secrets and episode 36 of the Tax Professionals Podcast. The show notes for this episode are at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP36. The show notes will include a link to Peter's website, his LinkedIn, his Twitter, a link to my free course to help you accelerate your tax career progression, and also a link to the previous episode of Tax Career Success Secrets with Bill Dodwell. There are 35 previous episodes of the podcast covering a variety of topics from tips to pass the ATT and CTA exams to improving your soft skills. They're relevant to working in tax, such as writing tax advice as well. You can access all of these on your chosen podcast player or through the website, thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or sign up for email notifications to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes. The emails will give you a brief summary of each episode, which are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.